is a professor in the Department of Natural Resources and the Environment at Cornell University, and he is a wildlife expert extraordinaire. So that's why we've invited him here today to talk about woodpecker damage and how to prevent woodpecker damage to your home. So thank you, Matt, for recording. And go ahead, Paul.
All right, welcome everyone. Glad to be able to talk with you today about woodpeckers and bird damage in general. What I'd like to do is just go over some really basic sort of bird management principles, what works, what doesn't, from an IPM context, and then talk specifically about woodpecker damage to structures, particularly homes. Birds present quite a few dilemmas from a management standpoint. Many species flocks, and with these flocks, if hundreds of birds move into an area, they can cause heavy losses in crop situations, for example, in a short period. They're very mobile, and it makes it difficult to predict when and where damage is going to occur. Also, they're smart. They learn to perceive real danger versus just an annoyance, and most of the audio and visual deterrents that we'll talk about simply don't work. I'll show you some data about that. And often in suburban areas in particular, we see mixed species flocks where you might have several different species showing up in your yard, and nearly all bird species are protected. The only ones that are not are European starlings, English sparrows, and common pigeons. Those are all invasive species from Europe, but all other species such as the house finch on the lower left are protected under Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So it makes damage prevention and management more difficult. Lots of things have been tried as bird deterrents. You can see the list here, everything from pyrotechnics to audio, visual deterrents. Birds usually rely on sight and sound to perceive danger, so that's typically what's used. Unfortunately, none of these things are all that great at preventing damage, particularly for any length of time. We did a survey of fruit growers in 4 states just to get a sense of how they perceive the effectiveness of different types of bird control devices. And you can see the audio and visual scare devices, which are frequently used by a grower. The vast majority of growers think they're either slightly or not effective at all. And that's been our experience over time. The only technique that the growers perceived as effective the majority of the times are physical barriers, things like netting. So it's difficult to come up with non-lethal deterrents that work for birds. My experience has been over the years, things like the effigy models generally don't work at all. The raptor models, the hawk and the owl models usually don't do anything or may work a day or 2 at most. The sound producing devices that have audio recordings of bird distress calls and raptor predator calls. In fruit crops, I've never had success with those. I tried them in blueberries and grapes, and they failed completely. I did have success in a study when I was looking at red-winged blackbird damage to corn on very small blocks of corn. In that specific situation, they seem to do some good. Similar to the fladry or the flagging in the upper right photo, that can work with migratory Canada geese to protect turf fields or crop fields, but resident or local breeding Canada geese simply ignore it. So in certain places, certain times it can work. Netting or physical barriers tend to be a permanent fix. It's expensive, it's hard to do, particularly when you've got to apply and remove it in a crop situation. Shooting is only practical in limited areas, and similar with trapping, you can only handle the unprotected species, so that has very limited applications in area and time. So managing birds is a difficult prospect. Visual scare devices, again, huge variety of these. The literature shows that things that tend to employ motion and sound together tend to work a bit longer, but none of these things are going to last for very long. The same with auditory scare devices, things that apply both noise and sound, like the bird bangers, the bird screamers in the upper right-hand photo, typically work best, but that requires an operator to control them, and you typically can't use those type of devices in suburban areas. They've got very limited agricultural and practical applications. So auditory scare devices don't work all that well either. Let's switch and talk about woodpeckers, the focus of today's presentation. Most of the damage to homes and other structures is caused by the two species in the photo on the left. The hairy, which is larger, and the downy. These are both small black and white woodpeckers, very common in urban, suburban areas, and invariably, when I get called to a damage situation, it's usually one of those two species involved. Red-bellied woodpeckers are very common in suburbia. I rarely had a conflict or complaint from red-bellied, though I suspect it could occur. Sapsuckers usually damage trees and ornamental, as you can see from these rows of bore holes in this tree stump here. And so they tend to damage structures less. It's usually ornamental or tree damage. I've had an occasional call about pileated woodpecker damage to a structure. These are the largest North American woodpecker. They're about the size of the crow. And when they hammer into a house, you know it. I mean, they do considerable amounts of damage, but fortunately that's relatively rare. And red-headed woodpeckers are probably the least abundant of all these species. They tend to prefer very open habitats. And I can't remember ever having a complaint about a red-headed woodpecker in a structure, though, again, it's not out of the question. Woodpeckers have three different types of feeding damage. The most persistent and often sometimes the most costly is feeding damage. With feeding damage, you see pecking in rows or lines, either vertical lines along structures or horizontal lines along structures, where the birds are found gapped behind the wood, whether insect larvae or some other insect activity they can detect behind the wood. And they can detect those gaps, and so they tend to peck very linear lines of holes to try to find the grubs and larvae that are behind the wood. Another substantial amount of damage is caused by roosting damage. That's when the woodpecker actually bores a hole through a structure, exterior clapboard, and tries to nest or roost inside the structure to get away from the predators and the elements at night. These holes are round shaped, tend to be a little smaller in size than a tennis ball. Usually what causes it is poor construction, or when typically on a home, there should be sheathing behind the wood on the structure where the clapboards are laid, some plywood sheathing or some other type of wood sheathing. When that's eliminated, so you just got a thin clapboard sitting on insulation, that creates absolutely ideal roosting, nesting habitat for woodpeckers. They often come back and damage structures multiple times. Once they find a place they like, you can see two holes in this photo on the left. This structure had damage the previous year. Homeowner nailed boards over the holes that were constructed the previous year, and the woodpecker came back the next year and bored yet another hole. So it can be very difficult to get these birds to quit hammering into a structure that they like. And finally, the last type of damage is drumming damage. And this is more of a nuisance situation, but it does cause economic loss. In this case, you tend to find a single hole or a few scattered holes, often near an edge or a corner of a building, something that resonates well. Woodpeckers don't have songs like many of our other songbirds, and the way they announce their territory is by hammering on structures and yet rapid pecking that you hear when a woodpecker is hammering on a structure. And so what they'll do is they'll find something that resonates really well and hammer quickly, and that's how they announce their territory to conspecifics and keep other woodpeckers out. This is my home shed. Last year, actually said 2 falls ago, fall 2020, I had a downy woodpecker move in. It did some drumming damage on this corner. Then it excavated a roost hole in the soffit. I painted over it and patched it and thought I was done. And then fall of 2021, the woodpecker was back. And this next year, I've got feeding damage all along the edge of the shed. So this woodpecker has been very persistent, and I've got repairs to do this summer on my shed again. We did a study in Ithaca with several neighborhoods around the Ithaca community. We looked at 1,185 homes. It surprised me that 33%, about a third of the homeowners that were involved in the study had reported woodpecker damage on their structure to during the past year. And we looked at characteristics of homes that tended to lead to woodpecker damage. And one of the most important things is what's the home constructed of. And if you look at different types of exterior materials, the one that was most prone woodpecker damage was groove plywood, followed by cedar shake, followed by tongue and groove and board and batten siding, regular clapboards. And then if you look at the non-wood materials, the vinyl siding, the aluminum siding, you can see very low levels of woodpecker damage. So first of all, what's the home constructed of? The next variables that are really important in predicting woodpecker damage is the yard type and the sealant type. And there's a very strong trend towards more woodpecker damage in heavily wooded yards and wooded yards versus yards that are completely open and grassy with very few trees. And then the sealant type is also important. Homes that have stains on them, this dark gray bar, are much more prevalent, much more likely to see woodpecker damage versus a paint or versus a non-paint, non-stain type of sealant. So again, so it's wood construction type and sealant type, yard type, all influence woodpecker damage. And finally, we look at color. And homes that were colored in earth tone colors, you know, the stains that tended to be browns and grays and sort of dark greens, those early woodsy type tones, were far more likely to be damaged by birds than brighter pastel colors or houses that were covered with a white finish of some type. And so all these things influence whether or not a woodpecker is going to damage a structure. And at least in the Ithaca area, we found under the worst case scenario where you have a house that's got tongue and groove plywood and it's stained in, say, a rustic brown color, we saw woodpecker damage on those homes in over 90% of the time. I mean, that's just what they were seeking out in the landscape. So we decided to test deterrence and look at what was reported in the literature as supposedly reducing woodpecker damage. So Emily Harding was a grad student who worked on the project. We tested the effigy owl, suet feeders, bird distress call with woodpecker distress calls and raptor calls, and ear tape, so mylar tape strung on the side of the house so it could blow in the breeze. And looked at that on several houses that had experienced recent woodpecker damage. What we found, only one thing significantly reduced damage, and that was the ear tape, the mylar tape strips. We found in about 8 or 9 out of 10 houses that we put it up, the woodpeckers left and they quit causing damage. None of the other devices we tested were much better than 50-50 chance. This is estimated median improvement. Bird Pro putting up a squawk box, it's no better than 50-50 chance that the bird's going to leave. Prowler owl, slightly more. Suet feeders, slightly better than that. But again, the only thing that seemed to consistently repel the birds was the mylar tape. Doesn't work every time, but it worked in most cases. So we didn't see any significant damage with many of the common techniques you'll see in the literature being recommended to control woodpecker damage to structures. Other methods, there are other things that occasionally you'll see pop up in literature and extension publication. The only one that really is sort of foolproof is, again, putting up a physical barrier. Most people aren't going to do this. It's unsightly, it's expensive, and most people just don't want to take the time and effort to put up netting on the side of their home to stop the woodpecker damage. So they'll usually do some type of home repairs or maintenance first. Again, of all the different visual type of devices, the only one that worked is the mylar tape. The rest of these things are pretty much a waste of time. There have been some anecdotal reports that motion sensing spiders, Halloween type toy spiders that are battery operated, that woodpeckers don't like them. All anecdotal. I've never seen that tested anywhere, but it'd be interesting that if somebody wanted to try that to see if it would really work or not. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then open it up to, I guess, questions. Matt and Mara, how do you want to handle questions from the group? Do you have some in the chat?
Thank you so much, Paul. We don't have questions in the chat yet. I would encourage anyone who has any questions to go ahead and put them in the chat. And in the meantime, while folks are thinking about that, I do have a question for you.
All right.
If someone were looking for that shiny tape, where should they look to buy something like that?
Yeah, often the local agricultural or farm supply store often carries it in the wildlife deterrent devices. Sometimes you can buy it there. It's easily found online too. Just look for Mylar tape is sort of the search term. There's several different companies that provide different types of the flashy shiny tape, so relatively easy to find online also. I saw a question about the best way to attach the tape. I don't think it really matters that much. We just sort of tied it on. It's fairly flexible. So we put the cotton string up on the top of the house and then just sort of wrapped and tied the tape around it. I think you could easily pull the tape over and staple it. That would work easily well. Maybe a good quality exterior tape would work well too. So I don't think there's any one way to attach it, just whatever works for you. Question, would non-shiny tape work too? Possibly, but I think it's the shininess that the woodpeckers are partly detecting. Birds see in an ultraviolet spectrum that mammals don't. And so again, it's hard to tell exactly what they're perceiving on the Mylar tape. So I think it's some combination of motion and then there's maybe something in the UV filter that they're detecting that we can't detect also. There's just no way to know for sure. Okay, let's see. Other question. Squirrels chewing on siding. The thought on that is that probably if a squirrel's already got a hole through a soffit into an attic or a wall area, you're probably going to need a nuisance wildlife control person to trap and remove the offending animal and then do repairs. You're going to want to, again, either replace the wood so the wood's in good quality and new, and then may have to patch over that with some type of like a metal flashing that they can't easily chew through. I see a question about Mylar tape for deer. I don't think deer are going to pay any attention to Mylar tape whatsoever. That would be a waste of time. Most mammals live by their noses, and just like your dog, yeah, you know, the dog smells everything. And my experience has been testing a lot of different deer deterrents that odor-based repellents, good odor-based repellents tend to work the best. And so I would not expect any type of a visual deterrent such as Mylar tape to work for deer.
I will note on that question that Paul is presenting for us again in November on repellents, fencing, and other IPM approaches for managing deer. So you can definitely tune in then to learn a bunch more about deer avoidance.
Thanks, Matt.
Sorry.
Up is another question. I would leave it up for the spring season if I put it up. Usually the woodpecker damage peaks in April. They're late March, depending where you're at in the state. Southeast New York, Long Island, it's a little earlier. Upstate, it's a little later. But once you get snow melt, green up starts, they're looking for nesting roosting cavities, and you want to put that material up and leave it up through probably in the June. At that point, they're done nesting and we start to see some of the damage drop off. But they set up territories and start looking for winter roost in the fall, and so that damage will pick back up about the time you start to see the first frost and at the end of the year, and you'll get another peak of woodpecker damage to structure in the fall. And I see something about pileated woodpecker damaging weatherproof strips around windows. I've had occasional reports of that. So it does happen. And again, I would try the Mylar tape. We didn't have any pileates causing damage when we tested it. We had, again, the downy and the hairies. So I'm not sure whether it would work with a pileated. It may. If there's a lot of snags, would that provide alternative sites for woodpeckers? And the answer is that yes. I think that many times birds prefer the natural tree cavities, but again, that's going to provide good roosting, nesting habitat and very high population. So it may be sort of a double-edged sword where you've got high abundance that some are eventually going to cause damage to structures nearby too. Other questions?
Thank you so much, Paul. I think we're going to move on to our IPM minute. If there are more questions that come in through the chat, Paul, if you'd like to answer them in the chat, feel free. or we can send them to you after the meeting as well and try to get some answers that we can post with the video recording.
Okay, thanks, folks.
So Ashley, I'm going to let you go ahead and start sharing your screen. Dr. Ashley Kennedy is a tick biologist with the Delaware Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control. And today in our IPM Minute, she's going to be reminding us that tick safety is a year-round endeavor.
All right. Thank you so much for that introduction and for the invitation to be here. So let's talk about why ticks are still active even in the middle of winter. So I took this picture in February. For my job, I go to state parks and natural lands to collect ticks. And so that involves dragging a white cloth along the ground and in the vegetation so ticks can grab onto it. And very often people will stop to ask me what in the world I'm doing because it must look very strange. And on a day like this one shown here, where there's snow on the ground, people are often surprised to hear that I'm actually collecting ticks. And when I took this picture, I actually collected 64 ticks that day. And so the second question people have for me is how is it possible that ticks are surviving these winters when we're so used to seeing reduced insect and arthropod activity during that time? Well, ticks have a 2-year lifespan. So to complete their life cycle, they need to have a combination of physical and behavioral adaptations that help them get through all kinds of weather and temperature conditions. So one of the main things they'll do is the majority of the time, they're going to be taking refuge under the leaf litter. So that insulates them from the extreme cold. And even when it snows, that snow is just providing an extra layer that keeps them, cozy and warm underneath. So they're staying out of trouble that way. And they also have what you can think of as a natural antifreeze in their cells. So compared to our body cells, which have a higher water content, their cells have a lower freezing point. And another thing to consider is just that in many parts of the world, winters are a lot warmer than they used to be on average. So we may have some tick species that wouldn't be able to survive a long, severe winter, but when it comes to a short, mild winter, they're doing just fine. So I'm going to go over some of the ticks that you might expect to see over the next month. And the first one is black-legged or deer ticks. This is the vector of Lyme disease. And the adults are active all winter long. That is, whenever the temperatures are above freezing and the conditions are just right where they are, they might come out looking for their next meal. So I have a picture here of a female and a male black-legged tick. And this graph from the CDC shows that while Lyme disease cases peak in the summer, they never drop off to zero at any time during the year. So even in those winter months, there's thousands of new cases, and those are all coming from newly acquired tick bites during those months. Another tick you might see is the Lone Star tick. Both the adults and nymphs are starting to be active this time of year, and they're not a winter tick per se, but they're active in the spring and summer. And again, our springs are in many places starting to come earlier than they used to. Similarly with the American dog tick, that's another spring and summer tick that's starting to become active at this time of year. And you might even see the invasive or Asian longhorned tick because the nymphs are active in the early spring. So these are all something to keep an eye out for. And the bad news is all 4 of these species are considered that they are all vectors of pathogens that can cause human illness. So you don't want to be bitten by any of these. So to that point, when you go outside, try to wear light colored clothing that will make it easier for you to spot the tick before it has a chance to bite you. You can also tuck your pants into your socks and tuck your shirt into your pants, and anything that will make it harder for the tick to find and access your skin. That will give you a longer window of opportunity to remove it. You can apply tick repellent. There are some products that you spray on your skin and some products that you spray on clothing. So just make sure that you're following all the label instructions. They'll tell you exactly what to do. And lastly, you can stick to the center of trails when you're outdoors, because that way you're not going to come into contact with the vegetation where the ticks are hiding and questing and waiting for a host. And when you come home, this is equally important. It's important to do a tick check. And you can use either a partner or a mirror so that you can check really your entire body, because they can crawl undetected to areas that weren't even exposed when you were outdoors. And I suggest taking a shower, because that will really give you an opportunity to check all your nooks and crannies. The shower itself isn't going to remove the ticks if they've already bitten you, because when they bite, they attach strongly. They've got a structure called a hypostome, which you can think of as like a harpoon because it has barbs to help keep it attached. But if you do find one, you want to remove it promptly, because the longer they're attached, the more likely they are to transmit a pathogen that could make you sick. So here's the thing. I know that most people who live in ticky areas have already heard all of this information before, and they're still getting bitten by ticks because they're just not implementing it on a daily basis. So my homework for you is to make tick safety a habit. To really try to incorporate it into your everyday routine so it becomes second nature. And this could be as simple as just putting a sticky note on your bathroom mirror, reminding you to check for ticks when you come indoors. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Ashley, for that very timely piece of information, especially as the weather starts to get better. There were a couple of questions that came into the chat about ticks. I will send those to, I'll make sure we get answers to those questions posted when the video is posted. The video you will be able to find here on our YouTube channel. And I hope that you will all join us next month in April. We're meeting on April 1st, and we'll be talking about protecting drinking water, especially on Long Island, how IPM is related to that, and also a quick IPM minute on cleaning up the garden in the spring. Have a great afternoon, everyone.